I'm Doug Fox. I teach at USD School of Law, where I direct the Center for Health Law Policy and Bioethics. It's an early project on which I'm very grateful for your feedback. In a 1928 lecture to the New York Academy of Medicine, Benjamin Cardozo, then Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, said that the law is, quote, derived from empirical methods of scientific observation and inquiry. Let the facts be known as they are, he declared, and the law will sprout from its seeds and turn its branches toward the light. In culture more generally, he noted, the bedrock conviction that we humans are exceptional and superior had been shaken by recent discoveries at that time that our species just evolved from some others and that our planet doesn't center our solar system. So too, Cardozo said, my emerging findings in the biology of behavior force us to rethink cherished ideals in the law. Liberty, equality, justice. His audience recoiled. There are certain questions that should not be asked, they said. Certain things that we should not know. Their reaction might strike modern ears, especially many of those in this room, as quaint at best, maybe dangerous. This afternoon, I want to try to rehabilitate a version of this unfashionable concern about research that might challenge cornerstones of our democratic life. Let's call it subversive science. After explaining what subversive science is and why I think it's worth worrying about, I'll offer some thoughts about what I think we should and shouldn't do about it. What makes science subversive in this sense that I mean it isn't that it deprives research subjects of informed consent or inflicts avoidable suffering on them, like the Milgram shock study or Tuskegee syphilis trial, or the prison experiment here at Stanford. Nor is subversive science about the more tangible kinds of consequences for public health or national security that can be invoked in so-called dual-use dilemmas over nuclear power or avian flu studies. These more familiar worries about the means and ends of scientific research, deeply important though they are not my concern here. Subversive science is instead about the power that certain lines of inquiry have to dislodge public faith in ideals that occupy a prominent place in democracy. Consider two. First is the ideal of individual responsibility that underlies much of our law that requires adults of sound mind to comport their behavior to rules. The second is the ideal of equality, that individuals shouldn't be judged or constrained by the average or assumed properties of the groups to which they belong. For an ostensible challenge to responsibility, consider the neuroscience research pioneered by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. Libet used brain scans, electroencephalography, to identify unconscious processes that can predict when a person will perform simple actions, like flexing a finger or pressing a button, not only before the person performs those actions, but even before the person is aware of his own intention to perform them. A putative challenge to the ideal of equality comes from a different line of research, this time group differences, especially in genomics, that examines the biological architecture of socially salient traits, like, for example, what you might call intelligence. Now, scholars like Hank Greeley, Oliver Goodenough, and others in this room have convincingly showed why research like this will not, in fact, displace the most morally attractive understandings of responsibility or equality that undergird our legal system. So I won't waste time rehearsing how the discovery of predictive urges still leaves space to preserve responsibility to decide whether to override those urges, or that equality isn't the empirical claim that groups of people are genetically identical, but the moral principle that people deserve something like equal dignity or opportunity, whatever their genetics. Well, then why do I think that subversive science is worthy of concern? It's because even if it doesn't threaten abstract conceptions of these ideals, it might still erode actual perceptions of them in ways that predictably distort legal decision-making. I'd come across some indirect evidence of this proposition, so I decided to test it for myself. I enlisted the polling firm YouGov to survey a representative sample of 1,200 American adults about their views on criminal punishment in a particular case and support for Head Start educational programs. The sample was randomly divided into experimental and 3 different control groups that differed only in respect of whether they were presented with one of the 3 various audiovisual treatments in place of accurate and measured accounts of the potentially subversive genetic or neuroscience described. Time here doesn't permit detailing every aspect of the experimental design, but let me tell you a bit about what I found. Subjects in the group that learned about the Libet-style timing studies were far less likely than those in the control groups to punish a clearly guilty defendant when they were asked to assume the role of a juror in his case. It seems that exposure to research about preconscious intentions tended to reinforce mechanistic or reductionistic accounts of human agency that bypassed a role for the mindful self to drive his own actions. In the second experiment, the experimental group was presented with genome-wide association studies of gene variants that were only very loosely linked to educational attainment. Again, this took form in a brief 1-paragraph written description and a 2-minute video. I found that subjects who were confronted with this research were far more likely than those in the 3 control groups to vote against a funding program to reduce educational disparities. The genomic studies, though their conclusions were described in fittingly provisional terms, inflated the very kinds of essentialist beliefs that Altacharo and Jennifer Handler discussed this morning in ways that appeared to confound their commitments to the ideal of equality among individuals. As I'll come back to later, these results cut across both scientific literacy among subjects and their various cultural worldviews. Now, it's far from obvious what we should make of these findings. There's undeniable appeal in Cardozo's call to let scientific inquiry take the law wherever it may lead. Subversive science, moreover, has distinctive potential to free our legal system from false dogma. This might range from exculpating minors for impulsive behavior to redirecting social resources to reflect the genetic contributions of mental illness. That could be a really good thing. Still, I think it would be a mistake to assume that the blessings of subversive science obviously or inevitably outweigh whatever social turmoil or legal instability it might generate. Now, I wouldn't ban this kind of research or cut off the funding necessary to pursue it. For one, as John Robertson and Natalie Ram here have argued, restricting subversive science in any direct or content-based ways could raise First Amendment problems. Besides, it'd probably be bad policy anyway, given the spillover effects on other branches of primary research and the serendipity that characterizes many of our most prized scientific discoveries. But more to the point, reframing the threat of subversive science in terms of perceptions instead of conceptions advises policies that target the communication of knowledge, and not its production. Now, scientists who are trained in the technical language of their discipline can't reasonably be expected, I think, to accessibly communicate the significance and limits of their own research in light of the implications and controversies that surround it. But my study suggested that scientific literacy wasn't the problem anyway. That is, those who tended to distort their understandings of this science weren't limited to those who had trouble understanding its concepts or underlying background. And it's not scientists anyway, but really the journals in whose pages they publish that typically control when and how the public learns about their findings. So I'd look to those journals and other such institutional gatekeepers to mediate the release of potentially subversive science in ways that reduce their risk of entrenching systematic biases like neuroreductionism and genetic essentialism. Cultural cognition research by Dan Kahan with Lisa Willett and others would recommend presenting polarizing evidence like this in identity-affirming ways, for example, by adopting headlines or narratives or authorities compatible with diverse worldviews. Indeed, I found that hierarchists were somewhat more inclined to embrace the anti-egalitarian implications of genomics research, and that communitarians were indeed a little readier to discard individualistic views of responsibility in the face of neuroscience research. But these findings weren't limited to liberals or conservatives, but they spanned the political spectrum in uncritically surrendering these kinds of democratic ideals. So what if, and here's just a couple ideas I'd like your thoughts on, journals or courts or policy research papers were to add caveats, like findings here shouldn't be read to support the view that free will is an illusion, or that a person's traits are hardwired by his genome. Or do you think maybe a head-on attempt to persuade in this way would trigger a backfire effect, only leading people to cling to their misperceptions more tenaciously than before? How about metaphors? Like that the complex interaction between genes and environment is like cooking, in which the raw ingredients and when and how they're combined all matter. The ingredients here are myriad genetic and environmental influences, while their combination represents the biological, psychological processes of development. And just as you wouldn't expect to define discrete ingredients as identifiable components in the dish that's served to you, there's no simple correspondence these disseminators of scientific knowledge could convey to their lay audience between a particular gene and particular aspects of an individual's personality or behavior. Now, these are just a couple of ideas, some preliminary reflections on which I would be enormously grateful for your thoughts. Thank you.